Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. Currently, we are in 1 Kings chapter 16, and we will be introduced to King Ahab. Now, if you will remember that Jeroboam had set the stage. He was the standard of how bad sin could be. Well, Ahab is going to step it up even more. So we're going to be introduced to King Ahab, and in case you don't realize who King Ahab is, he also married Jezebel. But we also will be introduced to the prophet Elijah in the next chapter. So let's get into it. All right, chapter 16, 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 1 said, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jehu, son of Hanani, against Baasha. Because I've raised you up from the dust and made you ruler over my people Israel, but you have walked in the ways of Jeroboam and have caused my people Israel to sin." Now, keep this statement in mind. He caused my people Israel to sin. So the people sinned as well. I want to keep that in our minds, provoking me with their sins. Take note, I will sweep away Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Anyone who belongs to Baasha and dies in the city, the dogs will eat. Anyone who is his and dies in the field, the birds of the sky will eat. The rest of the events of Baasha reign, along with all of his accomplishments and mights, are written in historical records of Israel's kings. This would be the kings here, okay? Baasha wrestled with his fathers and was buried in Terah. The son of Elah became king in his place. Let me go back and make one more statement about when you talk about the records of the king of Israel, of the kings here. And this is probably a good example of there are other writings we don't have, right? The records of the king. In other words, there were a few people who were writing records down, a few prophets that were writing stuff down, okay? And we don't have them. So probably in another, kind of a discussion, you could say, are there other writings in the Bible? And the answer is, of course there are. So, for example, if these writings of the kings would be discovered, they would fit right into the narrative here, and they wouldn't contradict. And that is really this discussion, the difference between when people say the different writings today. Probably most of the times they're talking about the writings of the Apocrypha writings. And in those writings, those writings were rejected, okay, because of the inconsistencies. So, for example, if we were to find this writing, then this writing would fit right along with the narrative here. All right, verse 6. Baasha wrestled with his father and was buried in Terah. His son Elah became king in his place through the prophet Jehu, son of Hanani. The word of the Lord came also against Baasha and against his house because of all of the evil he had done in the Lord's sight, provoking him with the works of his hands and being like the house of Jeroboam, and because Baasha had struck down the house of Jeroboam. Now, that was kind of again sort of a wicked deed, killing the king's kids off, even though it was also God's judgment, but it was still wicked. I know it sounds confusing sometimes. God uses the wicked, basically, is what you have. God. And when you stop and you think about this, some of this stuff may sound contradictory. It's not. In other words, what you find God is using what's here, okay, and most of it is wicked. Okay, wickedness or wicked men. Verse 8. In the 26th year of Judah's king Asa, Elah, son of Baasha, became king over Israel and reigned in Tazra 2 years. His servant Zimri commander of half his chariots, conspired against him while Eli was in Tirzah getting drunk in the house of Arzah, who was in charge of the household at Tirzah. In the 27th year of Judah, king of Azar, Zimri went in and struck Eli down, killing him. Then Zimri became king in his place. Now, remember I told you when we look at kings, we see this political battle, almost like, you know, you're watching, I don't know what kind of show, but a lot of these political shows where this fight over the kingdoms and reign and stuff like that. Well, this is what we see right here. This is a political aspect here. The political, you know, this king conspiring, knocking off this king, and then you're going to see a back and forth. Verse 11, when he became king, as soon as he was seated on his throne, Zimri struck down the entire house of Baasha. He did not leave a single male, including his kinsmen or his friends. So Zimri destroyed the entire house of Baasha according to the word of the Lord. He had spoken against Baasha through Jehu the prophet. And this happened because of all the sins of Baasha and those of his sons, Eli, which they committed and caused Israel to commit, provoking the Lord God of Israel with their worthless idols. The rest of the events of Eli's reign, along with his accomplishments, are written in historical records of Israel's king, 27th year of Judah's king Asa. Zimri became king for 7 days in Tirzah, so not a very long reign, okay? And this is going to be interesting right here. Again, we're seeing these almost made for TV, right? Made for TV movie scripts right here. Now the troops were encamped against Gibbethah of the Philistines, and when these troops heard that Zimri had not only conspired but also struck down the king, then all of Israel made Omri, the army commander, king over Israel that very day in the camp. Omri, along with all of Israel, marched up to Gibbethon and besieged Tirzah. And when Zimri saw that the city was captured, he entered the citadel of the royal palace and burned it down over himself, and he died. So kind of a very horrific way to die, by setting fire to the citadel, right? Setting fire to it and then dying in it. That was a horrible suicide on this case. Okay, a very horrible suicide. Woo. Verse 19. Because of the sins he committed by doing what was evil in the Lord's sight, and by following the example of Jeroboam, and the sin he had caused Israel to commit. So the rest of the events of Zimri's reign, along with the conspiracy that he instigated, are written in historical records of the king of Israel's king. So he didn't have a long, again, only 7 days. So at that time, the people of Israel were divided. Half of the people followed Tibni, son of Geneth, to make him king, and half followed Ormi. Now, so even now within Israel's camp, there are the divisions. However, the people who followed Omri proved stronger than those who followed Tibni, son of Geneth. So Tibni died, and Omri became king. In the 31st year of Judah's king Asa, Omri became king over Israel, and he reigned 12 years. And he reigned 6 years in Tirzah. Then he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 150 pounds of silver, and he built up the hill, and he named the city he built Samaria based on the name Shemer, the owner of the hill. Now, Samaria, we kind of see now the origins or the beginnings of Samaria. Samaria becomes Israel's capital. Okay, and this would happen all the way into the Babylonian exile. During the exile, actually, let me back up. This would happen all the way to the Assyrian exiles. Okay, where we get to later that God, in judgment, the Assyrians are going to conquer Israel, while Nebuchadnezzar will conquer Judah. Actually, Nebuchadnezzar could not conquer Judah and all of Israel, as well as, of course, the known world. But the first to fall would be Israel, and they're going to fall. I want to say somewhere around 80 years before Nebuchadnezzar comes. My timeline can be off. But they will fall many years before Judah. And during that time, you're going to see that other people will migrate into other people other than Israel. And over time, especially during the Judean exile, there will be a mixture of Israelites and foreign people that later would become Samaritans in Jesus' time, who would be hated by the Jews, disowned by the Jews. Okay? Alright, so this is important kind of turning point here. So, Omri did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He did more evil than all who were before him. So now he kind of sets the bar now. He's not going to live long, but he sets the bar. Alright? So you got Jeroboam, and now Omri, now it's worse than Jeroboam. Verse 26, he followed the example of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and in his sin that he caused Israel to commit, provoking the Lord God of Israel with their worthless idols. The rest of the acts of armies, I'm sorry, I keep messing up, of Omri's reign, along with his accomplishments and the mights he exercised, are written in the historical records of the king of Israel. Now, the idea, note the difference is the records of the king of Israel versus the book of the king of Israel, which we are actually reading the book of the king of Israel right now. Verse 28, Omri rested with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and his son Ahab became king in his stead. So now we are introduced to King Ahab. Now keep this in mind, King Ahab would be one of the most wickedest king. But notice his father was very wicked, had raised the sin bar, the wicked bar, I should say, lowered the bar. So verse 29, Ahab, son of Omri, became king over Israel in the 38th year of Judah's king Asa. Ahab, son of Omri, reigned over Israel in Samaria for 22 years. But Ahab, son of Omri, did what was evil in the Lord's sight more than all who were before him. Then, as if following the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, were a trivial matter, he married Jezebel, the daughter of Ithbah, king of the Sidonians, and proceeded to serve the Baal and worship them. Now, we're going to see this later on over the next few chapters. In fact, from here probably to the end of 1 Kings will be devoted to this wicked king and Jezebel. Okay. It's kind of interesting how he says this, right? In other words, he says the sins of Jeroboam was just a trivial thing. Just so we remember that Jeroboam, okay, created 2 golden calves. It said these golden calves, one he said in one part of Israel and the other in the other part of Israel, to dissuade the people from going to Judah, to Jerusalem, to the temple, and following the true God, right? He said, "Oh, that's nothing compared to what Ahab will do." Verse 32, he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he had built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah's pole. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel than all the kings of Israel who were before him. And that's saying a lot, right? During his reign, Heliel, the Bethelite, built Jericho at the cost of Abraham, his firstborn. He laid the foundation. And at the cost of Segub, his youngest, he set up its gates according to the word of the Lord he had spoken through Joshua, son of Nun. So we're going to get very, very acquainted with Ahab. He sets the bar, right? In other words, Jeroboam was the first to set the low bar, the wicked bar. Ahab would do worse. And now you see Jezebel. And what is interesting about Jezebel, there has been so much misteaching about Jezebel. And in some respect, Jezebel, if you were, for example, and it's just coincidentally here that I got red on. Okay. But the color red was associated with Jezebel. Now, a lot of Pentecostal, the old holiness Pentecostal people, the way they taught who Jezebel was this lady who was a harlot, a whore, who dressed in red lipstick, right? And a seductress, okay? And as I said, this t-shirt is purely coincidental, okay? But I don't know where they got that from, other than the fact that, and we'll see this kind of later on, at her death, she painted her face. But this just comes from people not reading the Bible, and that's the shame of this. So that you had people who did not read red, they did not wear red, certainly red lipstick, because it was Jezebel. And so when a person would be called Jezebel, it was a person who was a whore or a loose person, right? A fast person. And in which, again, a total misconception of that. Jezebel, as we will see, if you really want to have the accurate depiction of Jezebel, it was the woman behind Ahab. She was a wicked woman who drove the worship of Baal and drove the people through Ahab away from God into Baal worship. She was really the power behind. So she was really, if anything, you would say she was a bossy woman who manipulated her husband, who bossed her husband. Because of the time, it was hard for a woman to reign. So Jezebel, through Ahab, reigned. And that's really, so like I say, I don't know why the ideal of Jezebel being the kind of, now, without a doubt, Jezebel was a loose woman. No doubt there was debauchery, the sinfulness and all that, like anybody else. But that's not, in the sense, when you want to say her evilness, is she really pushed and drove the people through Ahab to follow Baals. Alright guys, don't forget to like and share this study. Hit that subscribe button. I welcome all of your comments. And I will see you in the next study.